April 1945. The Philippine Sea, a coordinates-less expanse of deep blue, where the horizon offers no sanctuary. On one side, a swarm of 200 Imperial Japanese aircraft. Most are A6M0s, known as Zeeks, stripped of their heavy radios and landing gear, replaced with 550-pound high-explosive bombs. Their mission is not to dogfight, but to disintegrate. 200 human-guided missiles traveling at 300 knots, targeting a single point of failure. On the other side, the USS Ardent, a Fletcher-class destroyer. 2,100 tons of steel. 325 crew members. Tucked behind its wake is a single troop transport. A vulnerable hull, carrying 900 soldiers, destined for the shores of Okinawa. Total lives, on the line, 1,225. The ratio is a mathematical nightmare. One ship against 200 incoming threats. The odds of survival, calculated by the Navy's tactical ballistics computers, stood at 0.004%. In the language of the Pacific War, that is not a battle. It is an execution. The USS Ardent was designed to be a shield. Its primary defense was the SK-2 radar, a massive rotating mesh antenna capable of casting a 3-100-and-60-degree electronic net over the ocean. This radar was the ship's nervous system, feeding data into the Mark I fire control computer, which calculated the lead, the windage, and the elevation for the 5-inch guns and the 40mm Bofors batteries. Without this radar, the effective reaction time for a sailor to spot a low-flying aircraft on the horizon and depress the trigger is less than 12 seconds. At 0800 hours, the Ardent was a masterpiece of naval engineering. By 0801, it was a blind giant. A single Zeke fighter, trailing smoke, but maintaining a terminal velocity of 350 miles per hour, didn't aim for the hull. It didn't aim for the bridge. It performed a glancing precision strike on the Ardent's primary mast. The impact was a scream of rending metal. The SK-2 radar dish was sheared clean off its mount, tumbling into the white wake of the destroyer. But the physical loss was only the beginning. The kinetic shock of the collision severed the primary cooling line for the ship's fire control computer. Inside the plotting room, the air grew thick with the smell of ozone and scorched copper. The automated targeting systems, deprived of their coolant, began to melt from the inside out. The Ardent was no longer a modern instrument of war. It was a 300-foot piece of floating iron, blinded in a storm of suicide bombers. The United States Navy's tactical manual was very clear about this scenario. It stated that without radar guidance and automated fire control, the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns, the ship's most vital defense against close-range threats, were ineffective beyond 1,000 yards. In the time it takes for a kamikaze to cover that distance, a human gunner cannot physically rotate the turret fast enough to track the target. As the radar signals flatlined on the bridge, the silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the engines. Commander Vance looked at the empty screens. He knew the math. 200 planes were closing in. They were 30 miles out, then 20, then 15. Without radar, they wouldn't see them until they were screaming down from the clouds, at a distance of 5 miles less than 60 seconds from impact. But deep in the belly of Gunmount 4, Gunner's mate Second Class Elias Thorne was looking at the same manual and reaching a different conclusion. Thorne was 23 years old, a former machinist from Ohio who saw the world not in terms of naval regulations, but in the rigid, uncompromising laws of geometry and physics. To Thorne, the manual wasn't a set of rules. It was a list of limitations that he no longer had the luxury of respecting. He knew the Bofors barrels were rated for a maximum of 120 rounds per minute. Any faster, and the heat would warp the rifling, turning a precision weapon into a useless pipe. He also knew that the manualistist cranks, the wheels used to turn the massive turrets by hand, were geared for a standard human rotation speed of 15 degrees per second. At 15 degrees per second, the Ardent was already dead. The kamikazes would be moving at 44 degrees per second relative to the ship's position as they made their final dives. Thorne looked at his loadersmen with sweat-slicked faces and trembling hands. He looked at the red-hot warning lights on the dead fire control console. Then, he did something that would have resulted in a court-martial in any other circumstance. He reached for his heavy-duty wrench and began to tear into the hydraulic safety limiters of the turret. He was overclocking a weapon of war. By bypassing the safety valves that prevented the hydraulic fluid from over-pressurizing, he was forcing the turret to move at speeds it was never designed to handle. It was like putting a racing engine into a tractor. The seals would likely blow, spraying boiling oil over the crew, but it was the only way to bridge the gap between human reaction and Japanese velocity. The Ardent was now a vessel of contradictions. On the bridge, the officers were bracing for a massacre, preparing to signal the troop transport to scatter a move that would leave the 900 soldiers defenseless. But, on the decks, Thorne was transforming the destroyer into a manual calculator. He picked up the internal intercom, his voice cracking through the static. He didn't ask for permission. He gave instructions. He needed every man who wasn't currently manned at a gun to become a part of a human sonar ring. He ordered sailors to station themselves every 10 feet around the entire perimeter of the hull. Their job was simple and terrifying. They were to shout bearings and elevations into their headsets the moment they saw a speck on the horizon. Thorne wasn't waiting for the radar to come back online. He was replacing vacuum tubes with human eyes. He was building a network of 300 nervous systems to replace the one that had been sheared off the mast. The sky began to darken, not with clouds, but with the distant black silhouettes of the Zeke formation. 200 engines humming a low vibrating chord that could be felt in the soles of the sailors' boots. The Ardent sat alone, its transport ship huddling in its shadow, 2 targets in a vast shooting gallery. The manual said the ship was defenseless. The computer said the ship was dead. But as Elias Thorne strapped himself into the gunner's seat of Mount 4, he wasn't looking at the manual. He was looking at the gears he had just modified, the red-hot potential of his overclocked hydraulics, and the line of sight that would determine whether 1,225 men would see the sunset. The first Zeke broke formation at 12,000 feet. It tipped its wings, a silver flash against the pale blue, and began its terminal descent. The human sonar ring erupted, bearings Walk 45, elevation 20. Fast. Thorne didn't wait to see the plane. He didn't wait for a visual lock. He gripped the modified cranks, felt the violent surge of the overpressured hydraulics, and swung the massive twin barrels of the Bofors toward a patch of empty sky. He was no longer a gunner. He was a component in a desperate manual calculation of survival. The distance was closing. The 12-second window was opening, and the Ardent was about to become a volcano of its own making. 0-8-0-5 hours. The first wave of 32 A6M0s descended from 12,000 feet, their engines screaming at full throttle. At this distance, 5,000 yards out, they were nothing more than black pinpricks against the morning sun. But to the men on the deck of the USS Ardent, they were the harbingers of an inevitable collision. Without the SK-2 radar, the ship's fire control was essentially a collection of gears without a brain. The Mark 51 directors, the optical sights used to aim the Bofors guns, were designed to track targets at a steady pace. They were never meant to calculate the erratic, weaving paths of pilots who had already accepted their own deaths. As the first Zeke leveled off at an altitude of just 50 feet, skimming the wavetops to stay below the traditional line of sight, the human sonar ring went into action. Bearing 0-9-0. Low, low. The shout came from a 20-year-old seaman named Miller, stationed near the forward anchor chain. His voice, amplified by the ship's intercom, reached Elias Thorne in the gunner's seat of Mount 4. Thorne didn't wait to see the plane. He didn't wait for the optical sights to align. He leaned into the modified traverse cranks, feeling the violent vibration of the overpressured hydraulic fluid. The safety valves he had bypassed were now screaming. The pressure in the lines had jumped from the standard 450 psi to a staggering 680 psia, 51% increase over the manufacturer's maximum operating tolerance. The turret swung with a speed that defied naval engineering, pivoting at nearly 40 degrees per second. Thorne squeezed the firing pedal. The twin 40mm barrels erupted. Standard operating procedure dictated a firing rate of 120 rounds per minute. This was calculated to allow the barrel sleeves to dissipate heat. But Thorne was dumping rounds at a rate of 250 per minute. Within 60 seconds of the first engagement, the temperature of the Bofors barrels climbed from an ambient 85 degrees Fahrenheit to over 800 degrees. The steel began to change color. First a dull straw, then a deep blue, and finally a translucent cherry red. Thorne could feel the heat radiating through the gun shield. It was like sitting in front of an open furnace. The grease on the loading trays began to smoke, then ignite, sending small flickers of yellow flame licked at the loader's hands. But the math was working. The first Zeke, caught in a wall of high explosive lead that shouldn't have been physically possible to coordinate, disintegrated 400 yards from the hull. The explosion was so close that the shockwave shattered 3 of the Ardent's remaining glass portholes, but there were 199 planes left, as the second wave of 50 aircraft split into 3 separate attack groups. The tactical situation on the Ardent shifted from desperate to catastrophic. The Japanese pilots realized the destroyer was the only thing standing between them and the 900 soldiers on the troop transport. They began a coordinated hammer and anvil strike, one group attacking from the bow, another from the stern, and a third diving vertically from the clouds. Inside the gun mount, the air was becoming unbreathable. The smell of cordite was so thick it burned the lungs of the loaders. Thorne's hands, gripped tight on the cranks, were beginning to blister. The metal handles were absorbing the heat from the turret's friction and the nearby barrels. More. We need more. Thorne screamed over the roar of the guns. He knew that the physics of the barrels were reaching a breaking point. At 800 degrees, the rifling inside the barrels, the spiral grooves that give the shells their spin, and accuracy begins to soften. If he continued at this rate, the barrels would become smoothbore within minutes. The shells would lose their stability and tumble through the air, becoming useless after 500 yards. Thorne looked at the buckets of seawater the deck crew had been using to wash down the blood and debris from the initial glancing strike. "Douse them," he ordered. The loaders hesitated. Every gunner knew the danger of thermal shock. Pouring cold seawater onto 800-degree steel can cause the metal to contract so violently that the barrel explodes, turning the gun into a fragmentation bomb that would kill everyone in the mount. "Do it now," Thorne roared. The first bucket of seawater hit the glowing barrels. The result was an instantaneous, violent expansion of steam. A white cloud erupted around the gun mount, momentarily blinding Thorne and his crew. But as the steam cleared, the barrels had faded back to a dark grey. The guns kept firing. This became the new rhythm of the Ardent's survival. Fire until the barrels glowed red. Douse them with seawater. Fire again. The steam created a localized fog bank around the ship, a shimmering white screen that actually began to interfere with the Japanese pilots' ability to aim. They were diving into a cloud of their own targets, making only to be met by a stream of 40mm shells emerging from the mist. Thorne was no longer thinking in words. He was thinking in vectors, bearing 270 elevation, 45 lead, distance, 3 ship lengths. He was calculating the windage by the way the steam drifted off the barrels. He was calculating the lead by the pitch of the incoming engines. He was a human fire control computer, operating on instinct, and the raw data being screamed into his ears by the sailors on the hull. But the emotional weight was starting to take its toll. Every time a Zeke exploded, Thorne didn't see a victory. He saw a variable removed from an equation. He saw the 900 men on the transport ship behind him, men he would never meet, but whose lives were now tethered to the integrity of his modified hydraulic seals. At 0830, a new threat emerged. A Zeke, hidden by the smoke of a burning sister ship in the distance, managed to drop a 500-pound bomb before being shredded by Thorne's fire. The bomb missed the Ardent's hull by less than 15 feet. The underwater explosion was massive. The near miss sent a geyser of water 200 feet into the air, and transmitted a kinetic shock through the ship's frame that was more damaging than a direct hit. In gun mount 4, the shock snapped the primary elevation gear. The barrels dropped, pointing uselessly at the deck. Thorne felt the impact in his teeth. He looked at the shattered gear, a heavy iron casting that had sheared under the stress. Without this gear, the guns could not be raised. They were stuck at a 0-degree elevation. They were useless against anything but a target at sea level. The loaders looked at Thorne, waiting for the order to abandon the mount. The ship was rocking violently from the secondary explosions. The sky was still filled with over 100 Japanese aircraft, and the Ardent was now effectively missing one of its primary defensive batteries. Thorne didn't move. He stared at the broken gear. "Get the emergency jacks," he whispered. "Thorne, the gear is gone." "We can't aim," one of the loaders shouted, his eyes wide with panic. "We don't need the gear," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a terrifying calm register. "We have the jacks. We'll set the elevation manually. We'll pick a kill zone at 20 degrees and we'll leave it there. We'll wait for them to fly into us." It was a suicide tactic. By fixing the guns at a single elevation, they were losing the ability to track. They were turning the Bofors into a stationary wall of lead. They were betting everything on the idea that the Japanese pilots, in their final descent, would all pass through that specific 20-degree arc. As the loaders scrambled to find the heavy screwjacks used for maintenance, Thorne looked out over the water. He saw 3 Zeeks forming up for a synchronized run. They were coming in low. They were coming in fast. He had no radar. He had no elevation gear. He had barrels that were literally melting and being frozen back into shape by seawater. But as he gripped the traverse crank, Thorne made a final calculation. He wasn't just defending a ship anymore. He was defying the very idea of a calculated probability. The jacks were slammed into place. The barrels were forced up to 20 degrees. Thorne locked the traverse and waited. The sound of the 3 engines grew from a hum to a roar, then to a physical weight that pressed against his chest. "Steady," Thorne muttered to himself, his fingers hovering over the firing pedal. Just a little more geometry. The Zeeks entered the kill zone. Thorne didn't just fire. He unleashed every remaining shell in the loading tray in a single, continuous burst. The barrels didn't just glow red this time. They began to spit sparks as the internal rifling finally gave way, turning into molten dust. The first Zeke hit the wall of lead and evaporated. The second clipped the debris of the first and cartwheeled into the sea. The third, seeing the impossible wall of fire, flinched, pulling up just enough to miss the Ardent's bridge by 3 feet. Its wingtip slicing through the signal flags before it spiraled into the ocean 500 yards away. Thorne let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. But as he looked at the horizon, he saw the final wave. 100 aircraft. The swarm was no longer a formation. It was a cloud of death, and the Ardent's barrels were finally, truly, smooth. The turning point had arrived. Not through luck, but through the sheer bloody-minded refusal of one man to accept the limit of his equipment. But as the horizon turned black with the final wave, Thorne knew the hardest part of the math was still to come. The Ardent was out of cooling water. It was out of elevation, and it was nearly out of time. But as the first plane of the final wave tipped its nose down, Elias Thorne reached for the last bucket of grease. He wasn't done yet. If the guns wouldn't fire accurately, he would make them fire more. He would push the 1,201st variable until the steel itself gave up. Because, on the Ardent, the only thing more stubborn than the heat was the man behind the trigger. 0-9-0-0 hours. The Philippine Sea had become a cauldron of grey smoke and white spray. The USS Ardent, a ship that on paper should have been a floating tomb 30 minutes ago, was still screaming. The situation was beyond desperate. Of the 325 crew members, 48 were already casualties, victims of shrapnel and the intense heat of the deck fires. The ship's secondary battery was 86% combat ineffective. Only Gun Mount 4, under the command of Gunner's Mate Second Class, Elias Thorne, remained fully operational. If operational was the word for a machine that was effectively melting from the inside out. The final wave of 100 Japanese aircraft was no longer a structured military formation. It was a swarm, a chaotic cloud of a 6 M0s descending from the clouds like a terminal rain. The SK-2 radar mast was a jagged stump. The fire control computer was a puddle of slagged copper. The Ardent was fighting with the technology of 1812 in a 1945 war. Thorne was now operating purely on the sound of the engines. The human sonar ring of sailors on the deck was screaming coordinates into his headset, but the noise of the incoming Zeeks was so deafening that the words were lost in the roar. Thorne stopped listening to the voices. He started listening to the physics. He realized that a Zeke at full dive creates a specific harmonic frequency. By timing his bursts to the pitch of the engine, he was subconsciously calculating the closing velocity. He pushed his foot down on the firing pedal and didn't let go. The 40mm Bofors guns were designed to fire in 4-round clips. The loaders were now shoving clips into the trays at a frantic, rhythmic pace that bypassed every safety protocol in the manual. They were no longer swapping barrels. They were dumping buckets of seawater and thick industrial grease directly onto the red-hot steel while the gun was firing. The temperature of the barrels had crossed 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. At this heat, the steel loses its structural integrity. The rifling those precision-machined grooves that stabilize the shell was literally being liquefied and sprayed out of the muzzle as a fine metallic dust. The Bofors were now smoothbore weapons. The shells were tumbling, losing 50% of their effective range, but Thorne didn't care. He was creating a wall of lead just 500 yards from the hull. 22,000 rounds. A loader screamed, referring to the total count of shells expended by the ship's batteries. It was more ammunition than a Fletcher-class destroyer usually fired in a month of combat. The peak of the engagement came at 0-9-15. 5. Zeeks coordinated a simultaneous strike from the port beam. They were separated by only 10 degrees of arcotactic, designed to overwhelm a manual gunner. Thorne didn't try to track them individually. He locked the elevation at 15 degrees and used the overpressurized hydraulics to sweep the horizon back and forth, creating a horizontal curtain of fire. The hydraulic lines, now vibrating at nearly 700 psi, finally reached their breaking point. A seal on the traverse motor burst, spraying boiling hydraulic oil into the mount. The oil hit the cherry-red barrels and ignited. Elias Thorne was now sitting in a turret that was literally on fire. He didn't move. He didn't abandon his seat. His hands, protected only by thin leather gloves that were now smoldering, gripped the cranks. He kept the barrels sweeping. He watched as the first Zeke was shredded, the second, the third, the fourth and fifth planes, seeing their comrades vanish into a wall of fire that defied the laws of ballistics, broke their dives. They didn't just break, they fled. The Japanese pilots, witnessing the Ardent ship that should have been blind and helpless transforming itself into a literal volcano, suffered a collective psychological break. To the Imperial Japanese command, the Ardent appeared to possess a new, devastating defensive technology. They didn't realize it was just a machinist from Ohio with a wrench and a refusal to die. At 0-9-30, the remaining 174 aircraft broke formation and retreated toward the horizon. They had come to destroy a destroyer and a transport. They left behind 42 of their own in the water. The silence that followed was more jarring than the noise. The Ardent slowed to 5 knots. The steam from the doused barrels hung over the deck like a funeral shroud. Commander Vance walked from the bridge down to gun mount 4. He found the crew collapsed on the deck, their faces blackened by cordite and oil. Elias Thorne was still in the gunner's seat. His hands were literally fused to the traverse cranks, the leather of his gloves having melted into the metal. When the ship's surgeons finally cut him loose, they looked at the guns. The 40mm barrels were no longer straight. They had sagged nearly 2 inches under their own weight from the extreme thermal stress. The internal bore, once 40mm of precision steel, was now a jagged 45mm cavern of melted slag. The final calculation was impossible to ignore. The USS Ardent had survived a swarm of 200 kamikazes. One gunner, using a weapon he had technically broken, had recorded 26 confirmed kills in 90 minutes. Most importantly, the troop transport carrying 900 soldiers remained untouched. 1,225 men were alive because one man decided that the maximum operating temperature was merely a suggestion. The cost was staggering. The Ardent's engines were damaged by the near misses. Its superstructure was riddled with shrapnel, and gun mount 4 would never fire again. It was a hollowed-out shell of a ship, but it was a ship that was going home. In the official Navy report, the survival of the Ardent was listed as a statistical anomaly. The Mark I fire control computer was cited as having failed at the start of the engagement. The manual was later updated to include the Thorne modification, not as a recommended procedure, but as a case study in emergency hydraulic overpressurization. But the real legacy of that day wasn't found in a manual. It was found in the 900 men of the troop transport who reached the beaches of Okinawa. It was found in the 325 sailors of the Ardent who saw the war end. Elias Thorne was awarded the Navy Cross, though he spent 6 months in a burn ward before he could hold the medal. When asked later how he managed to hit 26 planes without a radar, he didn't talk about heroism. He talked about geometry. The radar told us where they were, Thorne said, but the geometry told us where they had to be. If you make the sky small enough with enough lead, the planes have nowhere else to go. If this story of a lone destroyer defying a 0.004% probability of survival has impacted you, please leave a like. It helps ensure that the names of men like Elias Thorne and the crew of the USS Ardent are never erased from the pages of history. The Ardent was eventually sold for scrap in 1947. The guns of Mount 4 were melted down, the cherry red steel once again becoming liquid, perhaps destined for the girders of a skyscraper or the frame of a car. But the rifling that Thorne melted out of those barrels remains a testament to the breaking point of man and machine. History often tells us that wars are won by the side with the best technology. We are told that radar, computers, and sensors win the day. But the 1201st variable, the one that no computer can calculate, is the sheer, unyielding will of a human being who refuses to be told that the odds are against him. Geometry is a rigid science. But on April morning in 1945, Elias Thorne proved that even the most rigid laws of physics can be bent by a man who is willing to burn his own hands to save his brothers. The Ardent didn't survive because its tech worked. It survived because one man broke the tech to save the men. If this story of the USS Ardent and Elias Thorne moved you, leave a like and subscribe. Every like helps us keep the memories of these heroes alive. Comment below where you are watching from. Are you from a military family? Or did you just discover this story today? We want to hear from you. You aren't just a viewer. You are part of the crew keeping these memories afloat. This was the story of the 1201st variable, the man who outcalculated the swarm. Thank you for watching.